Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tobias Clerk, and I'm happy to welcome you here all for this press meeting. Today's subject is about the UPR 22nd session at the UN, and we'll speak about the state of poverty, criminalization, and violence in the US. For today's conference, will be moderated by Ejim Dike, who is from the US Human Rights Network. Before giving you the floor, I will ask you to receive a little present from the Geneva Press Club, which is the book Cartooning for Peace. And I will also ask you to sign our gold book, which will be here soon. So I give you the floor, Ejim.
All right. Thank you, Tobias, and thank you to the Geneva Press Club for hosting us, and thank you to all of you for coming out to this press briefing and for your patience waiting for us. We realize it's lunch hour. My name is Ejim Dike. I'm the Executive Director of the U.S. Human Rights Network, and we feel very honored and delighted to be able to participate in the Universal Periodic Review of the United States to hold our government accountable to its human rights violations. We named this briefing around poverty, criminalization, and violence because we see the three linked. In the United States, we have more money today than we have ever had. Yet we have the highest child poverty rate of any industrialized country of any industrialized country. However, for the Universal Periodic Review, not once did the U.S. government mention poverty. And we see poverty very closely linked with the issue of the criminalization of people of color, of black people, of brown people, of immigrants, of women, of trans people in the United States, because we find that the most heavily policed communities in the United States are also tend to be the poorest communities in the United States. We saw today that many countries called on the United States to adopt a national plan of action for racial justice. This is an issue that we've been pushing the Obama administration on because, again, we see that addressing racial justice in the United States in the wake of all the police killings that we've seen, both by law enforcement and by immigration officials, will need a holistic solution. There's not one policy that will fix the problem. Yet, again, the United States government did not respond to any of the questions related to a national plan of action for racial justice during the Universal Periodic Review. So we're disappointed. We're disappointed by that response. We also saw that several countries called on the U.S. So it was almost a universal call that we adopt a national human rights institution based on the Paris Principles. The reason is that we need an independent body in the United States to help monitor and push compliance with human rights obligations. We do not have that right now. What we have is a mixture of different institutions that are not coordinated and, quite frankly, rarely know about their human rights obligations as vis-a-vis international human rights treaties. We found the U.S. government's response to that also insufficient. And then I would say the final thing that we heard people talk about that, again, was almost universal was on the death penalty. The need to eventually abolish the death penalty, which is disproportionately applied to people of color in the United States, particularly people of African descent. But we find that in the so-called criminal justice system, we find that people of color, whether they're of African descent, whether they're of Latino, of Asian, whether they're indigenous peoples, and again, as I mentioned, whether they're trans people, are disproportionately impacted at every stage of the criminal justice system. So today we have a range of speakers who will be speaking on issues that relate to all three broad topics: criminalization, violence, and economic, social, and cultural rights. We'll also be talking about broad national security questions, which also relate to those three broad issues. We find that all these rights are interconnected, so it's difficult to have a panel that only speaks or focuses on one question. So with that, I want to turn over to the speakers that we have today. And our first speaker will be speaking broadly on the issue of immigration, and is Carlos Garcia.
Thank you. Again, my name is Carlos Garcia. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. Grew up undocumented in that state, one of the most repressive, racist states towards undocumented and migrant peoples. We heard a lot about immigration today. I think the advocacy that has been done in the past has brought the issue to the forefront, but solutions weren't put forward. And the administration was not taking the responsibility that it has. In the situation of immigration, yes, a path to legalization is something that Congress is to do, but the enforcement of any migratory laws are in the hands of the administration. So in this situation, unlike a lot of the other issues, the administration has a lot of control in what's happening, and it's been a choice for this administration to now deport over 2.5 million people. We heard a lot of, a couple of mentions of the criminalization of peoples, the Operation Streamline, a program that gives people, that charges people with a felony for crossing the border, for being undocumented in the country. It's a program that's been happening for the last 8 years, where 70 to 100 people a day are criminalized for being in the country undocumented. They're shackled, they're brought through the court system, and charged, sentenced, and taken away to private prisons. There was mention of detention. Detention is imprisonment. They are the same prisons, the same private prisons that were used for maximum security prisons before, who are now used as detention centers, where now even families are continuing to be held. So one of the recommendations is to end family detention on the way to end the detention of all migrants. There was also mention of states taking upon themselves to affect the migrant population. The state that I'm from has taken away the ability to drive, taken away social services, taken away language from schools, and have made it to where every police officer not only can, but is obligated to ask anyone they suspect of being undocumented for their papers, causing rampant racial profiling and abuse of power. Once again, we've lost over 2.5 million people during this administration. We're asking for a halt to deportations, an end to Operation Streamline, an end to family detention, and the detention of migrants overall. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. So our next speaker will be Mary Garish, speaking on economic and social rights.
Thank you, and I appreciate you being here. And I wanted to say that although economic and social rights were largely ignored by the United States during this review, they certainly are an integral part of discussing poverty, and the denial of those rights is actually a violence against people who are already very marginalized. It's an insidious violence, for example, with healthcare. When folks cannot obtain healthcare, they're going to ultimately die. And it's just another systematic way of oppressing and denying rights to those who are just the most vulnerable. And of course, depending upon your economic status, if you can afford to pay for excellent health care, you may get it. If you're someone who can't afford to pay for health care, you won't get it. I have a lot of health care problems myself that have resulted in one of my eyes being blind. I have multiple sclerosis. I can't get the treatment I need. I know that I won't be able to do this work much longer, but that's nothing compared to what a lot of people suffer. People are dying, literally, for lack of being able to go to the doctor. Now, the US will tell you, we did a great job, and they did today. The Affordable Care Act, we gave everybody the right to actually purchase health insurance. But what we have to understand is the kind of health insurance we have in the United States is not what most folks in the European system envision. Because even if I pay my premium every single month on time, which half the time people can't afford to pay premiums, but they have to. And if I paid my premium every time, I still can't go to the doctor because I might have a $2,000, $5,000, or $12,000 deductible, meaning I have to spend that out of my own money, even after paying monthly premiums, before the insurance covers anything. Our insurance companies commodify our health. They are for-profit corporations that pay their CEOs and their executives billions of dollars, while those of us who need to go without health care are also not able to work because we're ill. We also probably aren't able to eat. And so it's just a downward spiral for everyone. This is a violence against the American people, and it isn't right that the US has touted these things as something to be proud of. So by supplying us with health insurance, it allows them to feel as though they're meeting the right. But it really goes beyond that, because as far as economic, social, and cultural rights, at the last UPR review, everyone was talking about the US ratifying ESR. And the US said, well, you know, we have trouble ratifying things because of the way our Congress is. And I totally get that. But now there's a principle called anti-retrogression that the United States has violated. Because now, in their most recent report to the UN, they don't even refer to healthcare as a right. They don't refer to any of the economic or social and cultural rights as rights. They called them measures. And now today they've got us classified under other issues. So I just hope that everybody will please help us to get the message out that economic and social and cultural rights are imperative to everyone's success in human rights causes.
Thank you, Mary. Our next speaker will be Monica Jones.
Thank you for coming. I am a trans woman of color. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, where there are mandatory laws, a mandatory jail sentence for sex worker-related offenses. We heard about trafficking at the UPR, but what happens is the conflation of trafficking with sex work. As a trans woman of color, the average income is less than $10,000 a year. How am I supposed to live on less than $10,000 a year? Being African American, being a part of the low income bracket, sex work is the best option for me. It was a way out, but yet I'm being criminalized, profiled for surviving, for thriving in a world that tells me everything that I do is wrong, that tries to erase me every moment of my life. The average lifespan of a trans woman of color is 35. Yet the economic status that we are at a higher rate of poverty, homelessness, HIV, and other issues. Trans women, we heard about gender, women's rights, but nothing about trans women, especially trans women of color. Trans women are so vulnerable in the US to violence that we make up over 75% of LGBT homicides. Yet the US does nothing about it. In the beginning of this year, we had 8 trans women of color murdered. During the hype of the Black Lives Matter movement, not one of these stories were publicized in media. Trans women are being erased at a high number. Sex workers are facing very much violence by police, the government, imprisonment. Marsha Powers was a sex worker arrested in Phoenix, Arizona, where she was murdered in prison by prison guards. She was left out in the hot Arizona sun where her organs failed Burns was when she was found. Her body was covered with burns. This was for surviving. She was a person with mental illness, and she was a human being. The U.S. treated her like she was nothing, less than a dog. In the U.S., we have laws that prevent someone from leaving their dog outside. But Marsha Powell was not deserving of these rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Our next speaker is Martinez Sutton.
Hello. I heard the government say that they're trying to improve relations between the communities and police. How long have they actually been trying to do that? I mean, before I was even born, the relations haven't been very good. They say they also took care of a couple of cases that dealt with police violence, which was in the hundreds. But it's been thousands of cases that have been taking place. One of the cases have been my baby sister, Rekia Boyd. She was shot in the back of the head by a Chicago police detective in his own personal vehicle. And all she was doing was enjoying herself. They told me she's innocent. But why wasn't the guilty punished? The officer is still walking the streets to this day. Over 2 weeks ago, he was found not guilty because the wrong charges was put on him. Instead of murder charges, first and second degree, they put involuntary manslaughter on him for shooting a woman in the back of the head. What I was taught growing up, you're never supposed to hit a woman. So why is this guy still walking around? They're locking up athletes, football players, basketball, boxers. But you can't lock up a police officer for taking the life of an innocent person off this earth. It's something terribly wrong with that. The U.S. can say whatever they're going to say about how they're going to improve relations between the communities, but the truth of the matter is, how can you do that when you're not even in the community? How are you also going to try to improve these relations if you don't give a damn about us? We get judged by the color of our skin all the time. But why? None of us had skin. How would you know who I am? How would you know my heritage, my culture? Truth of the matter is, you wouldn't. So why judge me because I'm darker than most? It's a slap in the face, disrespectful. What kind of humanity is that? I'm still out here fighting every day. My sister, all I got to live by is a picture of my sister. Why does officer get to go home to his son and his wife? I got to go home to a picture of my baby sister. The system has failed us, and it continues to fail us every day, every hour, every minute, every second. All we want is justice, and they feel as if that's wrong. I just hope and I pray that y'all can help us in any way that y'all can. Tired of fighting, I'm only one man. But that don't never mean that I'm gonna give up. I never was taught it, and I never will. Thank you.
Thank you, Martinez.
Sorry.
Thank you, Martinez. Our next speaker is Chief Gary Harrison.
Thank you. I'm Traditional Chief from Alaska. I'm here to cover some indigenous issues. And at the At the review, there was 27 countries that mentioned indigenous peoples' issues. I'll cover the first three real quick. I got 4 issues. When it comes to permitting mining on sacred lands to indigenous people, the U.S. only consults with them. It does not gain their free, prior, and informed consent. Consultation is when they talk to us, get our opinion, and then they go do whatever they were going to do to begin with, which is mine our sacred lands. The U.S. has ratified over 370 nation-to-nation treaties with the indigenous nations, which the U.S. Constitution affirms to be the supreme law of the land. When is the U.S. State Department going to establish a fully participatory process in conjunction with the indigenous nations treaties, parties to effectively address violations of these treaties and ensure compliance and redress? Both the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2013 and the Indian Child Welfare Act were passed to enable tribal nations to protect their children from actions that violate their human rights. How does the U.S. intend to fully implement and enforce the Violations Against Women Act and the Indian Child Welfare Act, and to recognize the sovereignty of the indigenous peoples of the U.S., Alaska, to fully protect the women and children? When is the U.S. There was one nation, and I'd like to thank them, who mentioned Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico and decolonization. I want to know, when is the U.S. going to follow the decolonization according to Article 73 of the UN Charter to put Alaska and Hawaii back on the list to start the true process of decolonization? And that includes Puerto Rico, who they keep pressuring to vote for statehood rather than freedom. You know, there's a doctor, Dr. Albert. He's a psychologist, and he was also a prisoner. And he said that we suffer from the same things as prisoners. So we're prisoners in our own land. They've taken our resources, they've taken our water, they've taken our language, they've taken our culture, and we don't have redress of these grievances. You listen to what they said out there today, they're inadequate policies, they're inadequate answers to any of these questions that I just posed. And last but not least, I want to mention, when are they going to release Leonard Peltier, one of our political prisoners? Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Gary. And our final speaker before we open up for questions is Jamil Dakwar.
Thank you, Ajim. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jamil Dakwar. I'm from the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. My remarks will be briefly on national security issues that were discussed at the review. The U.S. heard today from both allies and foes, close allies like United Kingdom, Germany, Brazil, and others, about the undeniable and egregious human rights violations committed as part of international military and intelligence operations overseas. And I'd like to touch on some of those. Some of the questions and some of the recommendations directly were addressing the status of Guantanamo. And I think the United Kingdom put it very, very, very succinctly and perfectly. We thank you for the commitment to close Guantanamo, but we'd like to see it make it a reality, which is really what the United States should do. The problem with Guantanamo is that it created also a system on indefinite detention that we would like to see shut down with the facility. It also created a flawed system of military commissions that provide second-class system of justice. This system should also be shut down. So the questions related to Guantanamo were mainly addressed in generalities by the US government, were not satisfactory, and need to be addressed, and more effort need to be taken in order to close Guantanamo, as the president promised within before the end of his second term. The second big issue that came up, again, by allies and foes, by those who are very close allies to the United States, was accountability or lack thereof for torture. The United States heard from governments asking about what are the next steps with regard to the, after the release of the summary Senate report on torture program. This report was a first step in transparency, but the United States has not provided sufficient answers regarding accountability. There was a call for independent body on investigations of what was revealed in the CIA Senate torture report. We would like to see the United States making a commitment to make that happen. And from that follows also the right to reparation to victims of torture. In the Senate torture report, there are 26 individuals that were named as wrongfully detained, were found wrongfully detained by the CIA. The United States government need to apologize and provide remedy and reparations to these victims and others who suffered at the hand of the US government abroad. We also heard about privacy violations and mass surveillance. This is an ongoing issue that is making the world see the United States as violator of right to privacy worldwide. It needs to be addressed as part of the recommendations, and the United States should continue to address not only the privacy of citizens in the United States, but also people outside the United States. Because the right to privacy as a human right is a right regardless of nationality. And the last issue is targeted killings. The United States was recently admitted making a mistake in targeting a house in Pakistan where civilians were killed. And the United States government rightly apologized and will provide reparations to those victims. The problem is that this is done only to Western citizens, civilians who are attacked and killed, injured by targeted killings committed by the United States. The United States should conduct an independent review of the targeted killing program, bring it in line with international law, and provide remedies to civilians who are killed, not only Western citizens like a US citizen and Italian citizen, but those who are killed in Pakistan, in Somalia, in Yemen, and other parts of the world. And I would take more questions in the section. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jamil. So at this point, we're going to open it up to questions. Yes.
Regarding the health care, Robert James Parsons from the Geneva Courier.
Oh, sorry.
Robert James Parsons from the Geneva Courier and Truth Out. With regard to the compulsory insurance under the Affordable Care Act, I've never quite understood exactly how that works, because apparently some states do not have to enforce it.
That's correct.
And that means in those states, people who might be eligible for subsidies and actually get something out of this don't even have that option. And could you explain the range of the deductibles? Because I've always understood that was the big obstacle, because the deductibles are so high. Is $2,000 the bottom line?
There is one for $1,500 for an individual. And I also should have mentioned that it's not just the deductible. Once you've paid all your insurance premiums and paid all your deductible, you still have a copay when you go to see your provider. And it's true, in answer to your question, that many of the states have chosen not to participate in the Affordable Care Act. And it's interesting because our state of Vermont actually had passed legislation that we would have a universal health care system, publicly funded as a public good, implemented by 2017. And when the Affordable Care Act was passed, the federal government said, oh, well, we can't give you funding for that. We can only give it to you for insurance that most of us can't afford to buy. And even if we can, we can't still use our health providers. So the federal government gives subsidies to states relative to their health care program. And what they did was they said to a number of states who said, we don't want to expand, we don't want to get into that. The federal government said, okay, we won't give you the money. But the money was less significant than the state's desire to, apparently, to keep people from having health care or to have to be compliant with the provisions of the ACA, which are certainly better than insurance companies operating without those provisions. But the point is that it's still, the insurance company does not make money unless they don't pay out. So that's why deductibles are so high. That's why the copays. That's why they deny people care that need it, such as people who are trying to get treatment for cancer. And if the insurance company decides that they're likely to die anyway, they don't get the money for that chemotherapy. That is violent. It's a denial of a human right, and it's wrong. The copays vary from state to state and doctor to doctor. However, it would range from $35 to $50 on the low end to $250 on the high end. It's not a percentage, it's a copay per visit. So if you have to make several visits in order to complete that health issue, then you have several copays.
It's not health care reform. What it is it's compulsory for the insurance companies for us to pay them. And if you don't pay them, then when it comes to the income tax, they will take money from you from the income tax. So it's not health care reform, it's just another insurance bill to make the insurance companies money. Sorry for butting in.
Yes, sir. I think you might need the mic.
Boris Engelson, I am a local freelancer, not specialized in human rights, by the way. There is something unusually touching in this meeting because we hear the voice of genuine spokespeople of genuine victims. Still, there are two different categories of issues you raise which cannot be fixed in the same simple way through human rights procedures. When you speak of stopping detaining families of immigrants, we see clearly what the solution could be. When you refer to Guantanamo as well, when you say paying damages to victims, we see clearly how it could rather simply be fixed. When it comes to welfare, to health, to poverty, you have an elected government, you have a constitution, you have a lot of rights for minorities, you have had affirmative action, quotas, everything has been tried. You have had a big debate on precisely health care. So it is much less clear to me how the holy sacred words of human rights do focus on the issue and can bring an easy solution, besides sending the Swiss army to take over the United States and implement with all hidden gold all what has not been achieved in 2 or 3 centuries of independence.
Thank you for the question. I'll answer briefly to say that when we come to the UN to use these mechanisms, it's for a number of reasons. One is to raise awareness because we need the international community to also help in pushing the US government towards complying with the international human rights standards that are articulated in these treaties. The second is on the issue of health care. We don't have human right to health care recognized in the Constitution. And that had a direct influence in the kind of health care reform that we passed in the United States. There was an option, there was brief consideration on universal health care, looking at a single payer system. There was also,
But even if you
Wait,
include
well,
that in the Constitution,
Well, what we're saying is that if those rights are recognized, if we did have a single payer system in the United States, we would not have some of the problems that Mary just talked about. Because right now, in terms of, because private companies provide health insurance and health coverage, they decide what kind of health coverage you get based on how much profit they can make. If we had a single payer system, or if we even had a public health option, a public option where private companies were allowed to compete with the government option, it would mean that the prices would be driven down and it wouldn't be out of reach for common citizens. So we're talking about ideals that we're trying to hold our government accountable to, as well as using this platform, like most communities around the world have used the global platform to raise awareness, put pressure on our government to do the right thing.
There's one thing else that you may not know, but the insurance companies are one of the most influential lobbyists in the United States. They're one of the most powerful lobbying groups there, and that's why you have mandatory insurance nowadays without the, and they don't have to comply. They've had a law passed that says that they're not gonna be even audited. So when you have that kind of power, it's almost unfettered.
Are there any more questions? Okay, before we end, I would be remiss not to mention, you know, Chief Gary Harrison mentioned, brought up the issue of political prisoners. So I did want to say that in the United States, we still continue to have several political prisoners in addition to Leonard Peltier. In fact, we have someone in the audience who was formerly a political prisoner. So that's also an issue that we had, that was raised the last time during the Universal Periodic Review that they failed to mention this time.
I have something else I'd like to address.
Okay, and I think we have 3 minutes. Oh.
Let's go over there.
Thank you. One of the problems in Switzerland, for example, Switzerland ranks at the bottom of the list of all the European countries, even though it's not within the European Union, for labor rights. And one of the problems is when one tries to bring a case before the court usually declares that it is without merit, and which in French is called irrecevable. They can't receive it as a formal complaint. I've seen some examples of this in the United States. Given the movement of the judgeships to the right, to the far right, to the right of Genghis Khan even, to what extent is this option of the court being exercised now in order to prevent you from asserting your rights before the courts? Because first, and then there's also the matter I'd like somebody to say something about regarding the simple cost. What does it cost to go to court, for example, to bring a civil suit for police violence or whatever? How available are pro bono lawyers? What are lawyers asking? What are court fees, and so on? So, even if you want to work within the system, to what extent can you make the system work for you?
Yeah, just very briefly. We've noticed in the last, and we've been documented very well the rollback on civil remedies, and in general in the United States, the fact that the U.S. courts are not themselves are not provided full effective remedies to victims of human rights and civil rights violations. Not number one. Number two, the government is contributing to that. In the sense of cutting funding to legal aid, cutting funding to other programs that will enable people to exercise their right. The United States doesn't have the right to be represented in civil proceeding. There are very few programs that provide poor people to be able to access their rights or to access the court system. So if you look from racial discrimination cases, particularly around police brutality, how these cases are sometimes also being dismissed on qualified immunity and such, to prevent people who are victims of police brutality from accessing justice to other areas that we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years. So that requires not only federal government action, but also congressional legislative action. Sometimes it's a U.S. Supreme Court jurisprudence that made things worse. We know how the Supreme Court has also, in a number of cases, eliminated the possibility of filing class action cases, particularly on behalf of workers and workers' rights cases. And as such, so there is a trend in the United States that is really a dangerous trend that limits the access to court and closes the door to the court and to independent judiciary to be able to assess their. In the area of national security, we've seen all the civil litigation, all the civil cases that were brought on behalf of victims of torture were all dismissed on state secret privilege, qualified immunity, on other procedural basis like political question. And to this day, not a single victim of the torture program had their day in court. So that gives you an idea what that means. And the United States today said, our citizens have the right to assert their claims and access our courts. That's pretty disingenuous in my view.
Okay, well,
May I add something, please?
can we continue it afterwards, because I think we need to end right on time. No? Okay, that was
Well, there's also a matter of funding and everything. For instance, if you're being charged, you're gonna have the full weight of the state coming after you. Yet, if you're underprivileged and are using the public defender's office, they're often underpaid and under-resourced. So when you don't have the resources to defend yourself, and they're not gonna defend you either, and you have the full weight, which means they have all the resources available to prosecute you, it makes it a lot harder to present a defense that's gonna, yes.
Okay, so,
Will a comprehensive list of the speakers be available?
yes, we will provide that to you right after.
Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yours is not an easy one, but you cheered me up.